the Gen Z stare. Millennials are saying one thing and Gen Z is saying another. But who's right, and is this really a new trend at all? Hello Internet, welcome to Style Theory, the show that has its eyes on you. Oh, sorry, am I making you uncomfortable? It's just my Style Theory stare. I'm working on it. Why? Well, the only thing I've been hearing about for the last week is the Gen Z stare. It's a trend that is literally everywhere.
There's a new phenomenon that's taking over. It's called the Gen Z stare.
The Gen Z stare.
Gen Z stare.
The Gen Z stare.
This is a Gen Z stare. People have been talking about the Gen Z stare, the Gen Z stare.
So of course, we also need to talk about it because no one can really decide what the Gen Z stare actually is. Millennials say one thing and Gen Z says another.
The reason why we're staring at you like that is because whatever you just said or did was stupid.
The Gen Z stare is not just a disassociation because somebody came into your work and said something stupid.
Okay, I see that this is a very sensitive topic with a lot of feelings all around. But the one thing that people can seem to mostly agree on is that this expression can be described as a flat stare with potentially raised eyebrows. But not like Vulcan raised eyebrows, more like Botox raised eyebrows. But without the Botox, probably. Again, I say mostly because even this part of the conversation is highly debated. But overall, it seems to be the most universally agreed upon description of the stare. Also, I have to tell you this because as I was writing this episode, I was telling my mom about it, and she turns to me and she just goes, "Oh, the Amy expression?" Roasted by my own mother. Anyway, even within their own groups, Millennials and Gen Z can't seem to agree upon one definition of this stare. And I know this for a fact because you told me so. Over on Instagram, I gave you all a pop quiz to try and suss out what people thought the Gen Z stare actually was. And the results were very revealing. Yeah, turns out that people have opinions. Who would have guessed? While there were a number of people who had no idea what the Gen Z stare was, congratulations for not being chronically online. What's that like? The rest of the internet had a lot to say. I don't know if I've ever gotten this many responses to a question on Instagram. You all went off, and I love you for it. But after gathering all the data from your responses, as well as doing a deep dive into the rather intense discourse around the subject, I was able to divide the answers for what is the Gen Z stare into two main buckets. The millennial definition, Gen Z is rude and doesn't know how to function in actual society. And the Gen Z definition, you asked a stupid question. Now there is a little bit of overlap in these buckets, but it does raise a bigger question. Who is right in this scenario, millennials or Gen Z? We'll have to take a closer look. Hi, this is Amy from the future. I need to tell you something very important, okay? This has to stay just between us. There is a secret third answer, something that could flip the table on this entire conversation, but you will need to stay tuned till the end of the video to find out. Since this whole phenomena started with Gen Z, we'll start with their definition and let them state their case. The overall consensus is that the stare is a response to being asked a question that has an obvious answer, or as the kids like to say, being asked a stupid question. Oh my god, I feel like my soul just left my body after that. Okay, let's break this down. Starting with who exactly is Gen Z. Gen Z is the generation born roughly between 1997 and 2012, though there is a little wiggle room on either side for that zillennial or, what exactly do we call Gen Alpha cuspers? Is it Alpha Zoomers, Gen Zalpha? Is it Zalfers? Zalfers? Oh, I'm gonna go with Zalfers. This makes the oldest Zoomer around 28 years old. Yes, I'm gonna stop you right there. 28 years old. I understand it makes you feel old. It's okay. We all are gonna be okay. Let's move on. The next thing to note about this definition of the Gen Z stare is that it almost always comes back to one thing, their job. We're now in a time where most entry-level jobs, both in corporations and in customer service, are filled with Gen Z workers. And by 2030, they are expected to make up 30% of the workforce. Also, can I say how much I hate the word workforce? It is such a dehumanizing term, and it turns out that is exactly Gen Z's issue. There are multiple articles and studies devoted to explaining how Gen Z is the worst generation to work with, approaching their jobs with a lack of respect and ambition. They've been called unprofessional, quitters, lazy, and now they're being called rude.
Yes. In fact, the Gen Z stare is disrespectful and unprofessional. You should not be working in customer service.
I'm gonna stop you right there because you just said today's secret phrase. The Gen Z definition centers around their experiences working in customer service. Whether it's food, retail, or something else involving communicating with the customer, this is the uniting experience behind their definition. There's just one issue with this definition of the Gen Z stare, and it's that this look is not Gen Z specific. In fact, this look has existed since the dawn of capitalism. As the ancient text reads, "If thou doth face a customer who doth ask a question so idiotic, it feels as if the earth itself does pause in its rotation, as if to say, did thou just sayest that? Then they shall be met with a gaze most punishing," or something like that. But this definition of the Gen Z stare is just a new name for an old concept, the customer service face. While Gen Z is now discovering the joys of dealing with, let's say, difficult customers, it's not a new concept. You can find Reddit threads, chat groups, and BuzzFeed listicles from years and years ago all talking about the same experiences. If you've ever heard the phrase bad customer service, often what that customer is really experiencing is a worker at the end of their rope, having worked 8-hour shifts for the last 5 days, answering the same questions over and over and over again. It gets to you. As someone who worked in customer service for over 5 years, I can tell you there were plenty of times where my face said everything. And there were definitely times where customers got mad at me for not going above and beyond for them, which is to say that I couldn't give them exactly what they wanted. There's just only so many times that you can tell a parent that no, their child cannot take this book for free because this is a bookstore and not a library before you just kind of want to give up on humanity. You know? There's a reason why phrases like service with a smile or the customer is always right have started to fall out of fashion. Fashion. Just take a look at this graph. That spike that we see in March of 2024, that was actually a spike in people dissecting the original quote. You know, the one that goes, the customer is always right, in terms of taste. Meaning that if, say, you are working at a coffee shop and you recommend they order the mocha because you think it's great, but they think that mochas are gross, then they are right, and they shouldn't order it and spend their money on something they won't like. Yes, that is literally the only thing this phrase means. But the modern interpretation, the customer is always right, period, gives all the power to the customer, leaving no defense for the worker, which they are pushing back against. Workers, whether they are Gen Z, millennial, or other, are redefining the expectations of what good customer service actually means. So no, this is not a new phenomenon. There are literally emojis that have existed since the beginning of emojis that depict this face. However, it is the first time that millennials have been on this side of the conversation. Yeah, sorry millennials, the shoe is now on the other foot. But if the Gen Z definition is wrong, then what exactly are millennials talking about? Well, remember how I said that my mother told me this was like the Amy face? It turns out that we might just be approaching a generation who isn't controlling their facial responses the same way that older generations did, whether on purpose or not. And the cause of that may lie with our millennial definition. Now that we've eliminated one option as a Gen Z specific trait, it's time to look at the other side of this generational divide.
So this is my first time going through that checkout. So it like gives out the error that the girl needs to come attend to my checkout. She comes over there and she doesn't say anything. She just like grabs the cherries, goes and like waves them, comes back, pushes some buttons and like walks off. And like I was trying to, have a normal human interaction.
Now, I want to pause and take a moment to acknowledge that on this side of the debate, there is a lot of potential for very ableist language. And while I am not the most knowledgeable person to lead that conversation, it is worth noting because we want to make sure that this place stays a very safe space for all parties involved. While this video is just one example, it does a good job of showing what the millennial definition is: a lack of response to a situation that would require a response. And the reason that we are likely seeing a heated debate around what the Gen Z stare actually is because this situation also tends to happen in customer service situations. Though from the millennial point of view, where Gen Z is either the worker or the customer.
The Gen Z stare is specifically when somebody does not respond or just doesn't have any reaction. On this flight that I'm working today, I tell this lady and her daughter, hey, make sure all those bags are all the way underneath the seat. And the mom starts doing her stuff and this kid doesn't move. She just looks at me like this.
Now, while there's always the chance that someone is being deliberately difficult, that is not the root of this definition. That lies with what are called soft skills, which happens to be a phrase coined by the US Army. I mean, we all know the Army slogan, right? Uncle Sam wants you to go to therapy. There are hard skills and soft skills. Hard skills are job specific and require technical training. Think coding or learning how to fix a car when you want to become a mechanic. Soft skills, on the other hand, are the ones that focus on you and how you interact with others. This includes, but is not limited to, skills like communication, teamwork, problem solving, and work ethic. Now, soft skills are teachable just like hard skills. However, unlike hard skills, soft skills are developed over time from personal experience. However, unlike hard skills, most people tend to have a natural level of soft skills due to their personal experiences growing up. And that is where Gen Z comes in because yes, we are once again talking about COVID. COVID closed down schools, activities, jobs, everything. It meant that Gen Z, who were between the ages of 8 to 23 years old at the time, were locked away from all of their peers and forced to experience the world from behind a screen. Soft skills typically develop in childhood and early adulthood, aka exactly the age of Gen Z when COVID hit. However, in terms of soft skill development, COVID did not hit all of Gen Z equally.
Growing up, we used to go to McDonald's, and my parents really encouraged me to be the person who would walk up and give the order. During quarantine, there is an entire generation of children who not only didn't do that, but didn't observe other people doing that. And I think that reaction, it's like, why are you talking to me like that? They don't understand it.
While there is no one experience for anyone, you can divide Gen Z into two main buckets. Older Gen Z, who are 15 or older when COVID hit, and young Gen Z, who are 14 or under. The older end of Gen Z had more of a, quote, typical childhood, meaning they had the opportunity to develop their soft skills alongside their peers. Young Gen Z, on the other hand, did not. Not only were they isolated, they were dependent on screens to give them any form of contact with people not in their household. In the grand scheme of things, screen time is still a relatively new concept. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up entirely online with easy access to screens like computers and phones.
Like someone said, they're so nervous to engage offline. It's almost like they were locked inside during the most crucial years of social development or something.
Listen, I am not here to criticize anyone for being chronically online. That would make me the biggest hypocrite. At the same time, because screen time is such a new concept, we are only just learning about what that does to early childhood development. And the results are hard to deny. A study published in JAMA Pediatrics found that increased screen time can cause developmental delays in areas such as communication skills, problem-solving skills, and social skills. But with no other alternative, screens became everything for Gen Z: education, social interaction, and recreation. And more importantly, this behavior didn't change once the lockdown was lifted. And when you get used to living your life behind a screen, you start to take those habits into real life.
One thing I noticed is that children who spent a lot of time looking at an iPad or a TV, they didn't really understand that talking is like a two-way street.
They are just too chronically online to realize that in between your self-speaking, you have to actually engage with the other person you're communicating with. It's not just online where you just text and you go back and you text. Like, you actually have to keep the communication going, even with your facial expression.
I've seen this definition of the Gen Z stare described as buffering or going camera off in real life. And there is some validity to that. But this difference in response isn't meant to be rude. It's just that, different. And this is where that secret third answer that I mentioned earlier comes in. Because, like most things, the answer lies somewhere in between. It is easy, almost too easy, to turn a group of people into the bad guys, and to turn a conversation from friendly banter into a war of us versus them. When you boil this Gen Z stare debate down to its most basic points, there are 3 key takeaways. 1, the younger generation is angry about the state of the world. 2, the older generation expects the younger generation to uphold their version of societal standards. And 3, neither group wants to lose the fight. When the truth is, you're all losing. Hey, don't shoot the messenger. There are good points to either definition, but this argument has been going on as long as we've been giving generations silly nicknames. Before Gen Z was too online to exist offline, millennials were the titular bad worker. I used Google's custom time range feature to take a little journey back through time to the late 2000s and early 2010s, just to show how much the language that we used to use to describe millennials is exactly what we're doing now to describe Gen Z. Back in 2015, millennials were under fire for their job-hopping habits. Where previous generations would stay at a company for 5, 10, 20 years, millennials typically stayed less than 3. This was a big thing, and it made Gen Xers and boomers big mad. I mean, having ideas about changing work culture? How dare you? Back then, millennials were infamous for things like having a desire to have a better work-life balance than their parents, for being dependent on the technology that they grew up with, and for having shorter attention spans than previous generations. Starting to sound familiar? No? Not yet? Okay. Let's take a look at this article from 2012 entitled, A Gen Xer's Rant. What's Wrong with My Millennial Employees? Yes, this was a real article, and see what their key problems were with those pesky millennial workers. Here are my list of grievances. They're cocky. They automatically seem to think that they are God's gift to you, your clients, and your other employees. They're not afraid to talk to others in a condescending tone or talk back to you. They take things for granted. Millennials seem to think that someone should have rolled out the red carpet for them the moment they popped out of school. They think they're exempt from the rules. They don't follow through. They don't want to pay their due. Yeah, it's all sounding really familiar. Millennials, despite not wanting to become their parents, are becoming their parents. They are getting mad at the same things that they too rebelled against in their teens and early 20s.
Because honestly, all I see when you guys talk about this are grown adults who grew up in a pre-pandemic world and had normal social interaction in their teenage years. All I see is you guys bullying teenagers who are growing up in a much more difficult world than you did.
Millennials are starting to do the same thing that Gen X and boomers did to them, which is vilify the younger generation for not doing exactly what they did. They're mad Gen Z isn't grateful for the path that they paved, and Gen Z is mad at the world that they've inherited.
But look at some of these comments. You mean the stare that shows that we're done? The stare that shows that we're mad about how millennials and Gen X are the reason we have to work for the rest of our lives? Firstly, millennials and Gen X are not the reason you have to work for the rest of your lives. Just admitting that Gen Z is running around resenting everyone.
Now, Gen Z isn't without any fault here. Approaching the world without empathy or a bit of kindness won't create positive change. What the Gen Z stare represents is the same thing that's been happening for generations. It's a cycle of blame and anger at those who came before or after you. The Gen Z stare is to the resting bitch face what the millennial pause is to the Gen Z shake. None are inherently bad, but they are used to make fun of people just trying to live their lives and create this divide between generations. Right now, we are at a crossroads. Gen Z wants to fight back against the hand that they've been dealt. The bad job market, the economic dip, the political landscape, and they're using the only power they really have, themselves. Their actions, their reactions, their stares, and millennials will have to decide how they are going to respond. Will they keep up this generational cycle of blame that they inherited from previous generations, or will they approach it with empathy and understanding? Whatever you choose, just remember, Gen Alpha is watching, and what you do now doesn't just shape your future, it shapes theirs. But hey, that's just a theory, a style theory. Keep looking sharp. Coming up next on Style Theory. Who packs the best bag, millennials or Gen Z? Today we're taking the question of what's in my bag to the extreme to find out who's packing greatness and who should pack up and go home.